Welcome. Today we're conducting a really detailed analysis of the source material surrounding a conflict that uh, reshaped the entire world. It was called the Great War at the time.
We know it today as World War One.
And our goal here is to dig into the complex causes, the truly global scope of it all, and the devastating aftermath that we're still living with.
It's a critical examination, and we're going to stick closely to the facts and figures from the sources because the human toll is, frankly, shocking.
Let's start there. What are the top line numbers?
Well, the war lasted just over 4 years. It starts July 28, 1914, and ends November 11, 1918.
And in that short span?
An estimated 40 million total casualties.
40 million. It's a number so large it's hard to even picture. When you break that down, what's the most immediate takeaway for someone trying to grasp this?
Well, the military fatalities alone are staggering, over 9 million soldiers killed. But what really set this war apart, what made it so different, was how it blurred the lines between the battlefield and, civilian life.
So it wasn't just soldiers dying.
Not at all. The sources show that somewhere between 6 and 13 million civilians died from war-related causes.
What does that even mean, war-related causes?
It's everything: famine, disease, and in some cases, systematic state-sponsored genocides. It's this comprehensive reach into every part of society that ranks it among the deadliest conflicts in all of human history.
So our goal for you today is to synthesize all of this information. We want to build the foundational knowledge you need to really understand the modern world that came out of this catastrophe.
We'll explore that breakdown of the old balance of power, the horror of the trenches, the technological shifts.
And the political and economic legacy that followed. We're going to give you the specific facts that define this global reckoning. So to understand how a single assassination in Sarajevo could, spiral into a world war, we have to rewind. We have to go back to the 19th century and look at the failure of what historians call the Concert of Europe.
Right.
What was that system even designed to do, and what went wrong?
The Concert of Europe was basically an agreement set up after the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 to maintain long-term peace by ensuring a collective balance of power. The idea was that the major European states would consult and negotiate to stop any one power from getting too strong and dominating the continent.
But by the end of the century, that system was falling apart.
It was eroding, yes. And we can see three key dynamics that were really accelerating that erosion.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, you have Britain. They adopted a policy of splendid isolation.
Meaning they just stepped back from European politics.
For the most part, yes. They chose not to get involved in continental disputes unless it was absolutely essential for their own imperial interests. So a key moderating voice was just gone from the table.
Okay, so that's one. What's the second?
The second is the decline of the Ottoman Empire. It was known as the sick man of Europe, and it was visibly crumbling.
Which created a power vacuum.
A very dangerous power vacuum, especially in the Balkans, which were strategically vital.
And that brings us to the third and, maybe the most critical factor, the rise of Germany.
Absolutely. The consolidation of the German Empire after the Franco-Prussian War in 1871. It fundamentally changed everything.
How so?
Suddenly, you have this incredibly powerful, unified German state with a massive industrial capacity right in the heart of Europe. It completely recalibrated the entire political map.
And for France, this was an existential threat.
It was. Their immediate priority became avenging that crushing defeat in 1870 and getting back the territory of Alsace-Lorraine.
But their focus shifted a bit later on.
Right, it did. By the 1890s, French policy also started focusing more on expanding its colonial empire, trying to compete with Britain on the global stage.
So all of this tension and fear, especially around this new German power, it leads directly to these rival alliance systems that basically locked Europe into two armed camps.
Exactly.
Let's start with the Central Powers. How did that alliance come together?
The main architect here was Otto von Bismarck, the German chancellor. His foreign policy was incredibly complex, but he had one primary overriding goal:
Which was?
to isolate France and prevent Germany from ever having to fight a two-front war against both France and Russia at the same time.
He started with something called the League of the Three Emperors.
Yes, in 1873, it linked Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. But it was always unstable because Austria and Russia were rivals in the Balkans.
So it fell apart.
It did. So Bismarck moved to solidify the core of the Central Powers with the dual alliance in 1879.
That was between Germany and Austria-Hungary.
Correct. It was a mutual defense pact Then, in 1882, Italy joined, making it the formal Triple Alliance. This was a binding military agreement.
But the really clever part of Bismarck's strategy was that he didn't stop there. He kept a secret partnership with Russia going.
That was the Reinsurance Treaty of 1887, an absolute masterpiece of pragmatic diplomacy.
What did it do?
It basically promised that Russia would stay neutral if France attacked Germany, and Germany would stay neutral if Austria-Hungary attacked Russia. Bismarck understood that keeping Russia on side was the absolute foundation of German security.
And this is where the whole story takes a dramatic and catastrophic turn.
It is. In 1890, the new Kaiser, Wilhelm II, forces Bismarck into retirement.
And the new government makes a fateful decision.
They refused to renew the reinsurance treaty with Russia.
Why? Why was that so disastrous?
Because it instantly shattered the one thing that had stopped France and Russia from forming their own alliance.
What was their logic?
It was incredibly flawed. The new German leadership thought that autocratic Russia and Republican France were just too different politically to ever become allies. They didn't want to be forced to choose between supporting Vienna or St. Petersburg.
So by refusing the treaty,
they essentially pushed Russia, which was desperate for foreign investment and military security, straight into the arms of their biggest rival, France.
paving the way for the Franco-Russian alliance in 1894.
Precisely. And that's the core of the Entente. The other pieces came later. You have the Entente Cordiale in 1904 between Britain and France.
Which is about settling colonial disputes, right?
Right.
In Egypt and Morocco.
Exactly. And then finally, the Anglo-Russian Convention in 1907. But it's really important for you to understand the distinction here.
What's the key difference?
The Triple Alliance was a formal, binding military pact. If one member was attacked, the others had to come to their aid.
And the Triple Entente.
That was much more informal, at least at first. It was more a pattern of diplomatic cooperation. But by 1914, that pattern had solidified into a firm expectation of mutual defense.
Oh, by the early 20th century, you have these two massive alliance systems facing off, and they're both backing it up with an accelerating military buildup.
A massive arms race.
Let's talk about the most famous part of that, the Anglo-German naval arms race.
This was driven almost entirely by Kaiser Wilhelm II. He had this obsession with the British Royal Navy, and his top admiral, Tirpitz, convinced him they could build a German navy, the Reichsflotte, that was big enough to challenge Britain's control of the seas.
A direct challenge to centuries of British dominance.
It's a direct challenge.
And Britain's response wasn't just political, it was revolutionary, technologically speaking.
Yes. In 1906, they launched HMS Dreadnought.
And this ship changed everything.
It was arguably the single most decisive piece of military hardware built in the entire pre-war period.
Why? What made it so special?
Well, before 1906, battleships carried a mix of different size guns, big 12-inch guns, smaller 6-inch guns. The Dreadnought introduced the all-big gun concept. It had 10 massive 12-inch guns.
And what did that mean in a fight?
It meant it could engage and destroy any other battleship on Earth from miles away, long before the older ship could even get close enough to use its smaller guns to fire back.
So the key insight here is that the Dreadnought instantly made every single existing battleship and every other navy completely obsolete.
Instantly. It just reset the clock to zero.
So Germany, despite pouring all this money and industrial power into its naval program,
never caught up. They could never overcome that initial technological leap. They built a powerful fleet, yes, big enough to make Britain nervous and force them to keep their ships close to home, but not big enough to ever actually win a decisive battle against the Royal Navy.
And all that spending crippled German finances without actually giving them a strategic win.
Precisely. It was a massive, expensive failure.
And the sources show that Germany eventually had to admit this, leading to a huge pivot in their military strategy around 1911 or 1912, the Rüstungswende.
The armaments turning point, yes.
Right.
The German Chancellor, Bethmann Hollweg, basically conceded the naval race and shifted all that focus and money back to the standing army.
But why? Wasn't Britain still the main rival?
The threat from Britain hadn't gone away, but a more immediate and, to them, more terrifying threat had emerged. Russia. They were deeply concerned about how quickly Russia was recovering its military strength after being defeated by Japan in 1905.
And specifically, it was about railways.
The railways were critical. Russia was pouring money into building new rail lines in its western border regions near Germany and Austria-Hungary.
And that threatened Germany's entire war plan.
It did, because the German plan, the Schlieffen Plan, depended on being able to mobilize their army much faster than the Russians. If Russia could use its new railways to get its massive army to the front quickly, that German advantage would just disappear.
So the key insight is that Germany effectively chose to give up on trying to match Britain's navy
in order to secure their eastern flank against Russia. The perceived threat from the east became the #1 priority, even more so than the rivalry with Britain.
And you see this in the numbers.
Absolutely. In 1913 alone, Germany added 170,000 troops to its standing army.
Which, of course, triggered a reaction from everyone else.
Of course. France immediately extended its mandatory military service from 2 years to 3. The result was this collective surge, where military spending by the 6 major European powers increased by over 50% in real terms between 1908 and 1913.
The whole system was primed. A massive war machine had been built, the alliances were locked in place. All it needed was a spark.
And that spark came from the one region where the interests of all these great powers violently intersected. The Balkans?
The powder keg of Europe?
It had earned the name. The mix of competing nationalisms there was just extremely volatile.
And for the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the region was, existential.
It was. They saw Serbian expansion and the pan-Slavic nationalism that came with it as a direct mortal threat to their own multi-ethnic empire.
Why was that?
Because if Serbian nationalism was successful, they feared it would inspire the South Slav populations inside Austria-Hungary to break away. It could pull their whole empire apart at the seams.
And Russia's role in all this just made things more complicated.
Much more complicated. On one hand, Russia saw itself as the traditional protector of its fellow Slavs in Serbia.
But on the other hand,
they had their own strategic goals. They desperately needed their Black Sea fleet to have access to the Mediterranean through the Bosporus Straits, which were controlled by the Ottoman Empire.
So paradoxically, they didn't want the Ottomans to collapse completely.
Exactly. Russia actually preferred a weak Ottoman government controlling the straits rather than risking a powerful, ambitious Slavic state like Bulgaria taking over and potentially closing them off. This clash between their ideology and their practical naval strategy made Russian diplomacy incredibly unpredictable.
So before we get to 1914, we have to highlight a couple of specific crises that really ramped up the tension, starting with the Bosnian crisis.
The 1908-1909 Bosnian crisis was a critical turning point. Austria-Hungary unilaterally annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Territory they had been occupying since 1878, but it was still officially Ottoman.
Correct. This move not only humiliated the Ottomans, it enraged Serbia, which had its own ambitions to incorporate Bosnia into a greater Serbian state, and it severely damaged Austro-Russian relations.
It basically ended any hope of them cooperating in the region.
Yes. And then, just a few years later, you have the Balkan Wars.
The First Balkan War in 1912.
That's where the Balkan League, Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, Montenegro all teamed up and quickly defeated the Ottoman Empire, seizing almost all of its remaining territory in Europe.
And that showed everyone just how weak the Ottomans had become.
It did. And it made Austria-Hungary incredibly nervous, especially when Serbia gained ports on the Adriatic Sea. They actually ordered a partial mobilization. Tensions were incredibly high.
But the instability didn't stop there. The victors immediately started fighting amongst themselves.
Right. The Second Balkan War broke out almost immediately in 1913. Bulgaria, unhappy with its share of the spoils, attacked its former allies, Serbia and Greece.
And Bulgaria was defeated.
It was. The outcome of these two wars was this vicious cycle of deep resentment, insecurity, and supercharged nationalism among all the parties involved. It just set the stage perfectly for the final crisis.
Which brings us to the spark itself. The assassination in Sarajevo.
June 28, 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who is the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife Sophie are visiting the city.
And the assassin is Gavrilo Princip,
a young Bosnian Serb, part of a revolutionary group called Young Bosnia. But critically, he was supplied with weapons by extremists within a Serbian intelligence organization called the Black Hand.
So there was a direct connection.
There was. Princip fires 2 shots, and both the Archduke and his wife are killed.
And the reaction in Vienna is complex. Some sources say that at first the city was calm, that the event almost failed to make any impression whatsoever.
That initial calm is deceptive. Politically, things crystallized very, very quickly. The historian Christopher Clark called it a 911 effect on the political chemistry in Vienna.
Meaning what?
Meaning, the hardliners in the government saw the assassination not as a tragedy to be mourned, but as the perfect excuse, the pretext they had been waiting for to finally crush Serbia once and for all.
Even if it meant risking a much bigger war.
Even then, they were ready to use this moment.
And that using the moment involved immediate, organized violence against Serbs living inside Austro-Hungarian territory. This is a point that, demands real sympathy for the victims.
Absolutely. The violence was immediate, and it was officially encouraged by the authorities. They incited these violent anti-Serb riots in Sarajevo, which then spread across Bosnia, Croatia, and Slovenia.
And they were targeting prominent citizens.
Systematically, approximately 5,500 prominent Serbs were arrested and imprisoned.
And the human toll of just that initial repression was horrific.
It was. The sources indicate that somewhere between 700 and 2,200 of those prisoners died in custody. Another 460 were sentenced to death and executed.
And they used a specific militia for this, right?
Yes, the Bosnian Schutzkorps. It was a special militia, mostly made up of Bosniaks, that the Austro-Hungarian authorities specifically created and used to carry out the systematic persecution of Serbs right before the war even officially began. It just underscores how much ethnic violence was already simmering just below the surface.
So after this wave of internal repression, we get to the July crisis, which is essentially a diplomatic countdown to war.
Right. Austria's goal is now singular: use the assassination to destroy Serbian sovereignty. And on July 5th, they get Germany's full support.
The infamous blank check.
The blank check. Berlin assures Vienna they will back them completely, even if it means war with Russia.
Then, on July 23rd, Austria delivers its ultimatum to Serbia.
And these demands were written to be rejected. They were intentionally unacceptable.
What made them so impossible?
Well, they included things like suppressing all anti-Austrian propaganda. But the real poison pills were the demands that would allow Austrian officials to operate inside Serbia, to participate in the investigation and trial of Serbian citizens on Serbian soil.
Which would effectively violate their sovereignty.
It would turn Serbia into a protectorate.
But it's remarkable how much Serbia actually agreed to.
They did. They accepted 8 of the 10 demands. They conceded on everything that didn't fundamentally destroy their status as an independent nation.
But it wasn't enough.
No. Austria seized on the rejection of those 2 key clauses, declared the response a full rejection, broke off diplomatic relations, and on July 28th, declared war on Serbia and began shelling Belgrade. The clock had run out.
And then the chain reaction, the one everyone had feared, becomes unstoppable.
Russia, feeling obligated to protect Serbia, orders a general mobilization of its massive army on July 30th.
And for Germany, that full mobilization is seen as a direct act of war.
Yes. So on July 31st, Germany issues its own ultimatums. One to Russia, demanding they halt mobilization, and one to France, demanding they declare neutrality.
Russia refuses.
Russia refuses. So Germany declares war on Russia on August 1st. France orders its own mobilization, but they hold off on a declaration, hoping to make Germany look like the clear aggressor.
But Germany's entire war plan, the Schlieffen Plan, it depends on moving fast, on striking first in the West.
It does. So on August 2nd, German troops occupy Luxembourg, and critically, they demand free passage across neutral Belgium to execute their big flanking maneuver into France.
And the invasion of Belgium on August 4th is what finally brings Britain into the war.
Under the 1839 Treaty of London, which guaranteed Belgian neutrality, by midnight on August 4th, all the great powers of Europe were at war with each other.
The opening months of that war were defined by Germany's enormous gamble to avoid that two-front war, the Schlieffen Plan. It was designed to be a lightning victory.
The concept was logistically brilliant, but as we saw, diplomatically, it was a disaster because of Belgium. The strategy was to put 80% of the German army in the West to crush France in 6 weeks, which was how long they thought it would take Russia to fully mobilize.
And the key was this huge, sweeping, flanking maneuver through Belgium.
Right, through Belgium and the Netherlands, to encircle Paris from the west and force a quick surrender. Then they could rush all those troops back east to face Russia.
But the plan that was actually executed in 1914 wasn't the original plan. It had been modified by the new head of the German General Staff, Moltke the Younger.
And those modifications were fatal. Moltke was more cautious. He canceled the planned invasion of the Netherlands, which narrowed the corridor for the advance.
But the most critical error was weakening the main attacking force.
He weakened the decisive right wing, the giant hammer that was supposed to swing around Paris. The original plan called for a troop ratio of something like 85 to 15, overwhelmingly strong on the right. Moltke changed it to about 70 to 30.
And what was the consequence of that change? Why was it so fatal?
It meant the right wing just ran out of steam. They were exhausted, their supply lines were stretched to the breaking point, and the weakened force didn't have the sheer mass to push through the final defenses.
It also allowed the French and British to find a weakness.
A critical, undefended gap that opened up between the German First and Second Armies as they approached Paris.
And that opening was the opportunity the Allies needed, which led to the First Battle of the Marne in September 1914.
Exactly. French reserves, famously rushed to the front in Parisian taxicabs, were poured into that gap. The German advance was stopped cold.
And they were forced to retreat.
A significant retreat, 40 to 80 kilometers. And with that, the Schlieffen Plan had failed. Germany was now stuck in the exact situation it was designed to prevent, a long two-front war.
And the German High Command knew it immediately.
Yes, there's a famous quote from Crown Prince Wilhelm at the time. "We have lost the war. It will go on for a long time, but lost it is already."
And after the Marne, you get the race to the sea.
Which was this series of failed attempts by both sides to outflank each other, which just resulted in them digging trenches. It created this continuous, static, entrenched line from the English Channel all the way to the Swiss border.
The birth of the Western Front.
The birth of the Western Front.
Now, in complete contrast to that static nightmare, the Eastern Front was incredibly dynamic, especially at the start.
It was. Russia, despite Germany's calculations, managed to attack East Prussia within just 15 days of mobilization.
Which was a huge shock to the Germans.
A huge shock. And while it was a tactical disaster for the Russian armies involved, it was strategically vital for the Allies. It forced Germany to pull troops away from the West right at the critical moment of the Schlieffen Plan's advance.
But those early Russian attacks were, as you said, a disaster.
They were. The Russian armies attacked without proper supplies or heavy equipment. They were crushed by the Germans under Hindenburg and Ludendorff at the battles of Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes.
The losses were staggering.
At Tannenberg alone, Russia lost 250,000 men.
But even with those huge victories, the Central Powers couldn't knock Russia out of the war.
No. The Russian army, for all its flaws, had almost limitless manpower. But by 1915, the weaknesses were really showing. A major Austro-German offensive, the Gorlice-Tarnow offensive, pushed the Russians back hundreds of miles.
They invaded Russian-occupied Poland?
They did. By the end of 1915, the front lines were deep inside Russia itself.
And we have to remember, this was truly a world war. The fighting wasn't just in Europe. The sources highlight how quickly the Allies moved to seize Germany's colonial territories.
It was a very swift process. In the Pacific, New Zealand took German Samoa, Australia took German New Guinea, and, most significantly, Japan entered the war and seized Germany's treaty ports in China, especially Tsingtao.
Which gave Japan a major foothold in China for the future.
A very important one.
And what about in Africa? The campaigns there were much more drawn out.
They were. Places like Togoland and Cameroon fell fairly quickly. But German East Africa, what is now Tanzania, was a completely different story.
It is one man, right?
Colonel Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck. He led one of the most brilliant guerrilla campaigns in modern history.
He had a tiny force.
Fewer than 15,000 troops, mostly native Askari. And with that small force, he tied down over 300,000 Allied soldiers for the entire war.
How did he do it?
He refused to fight a conventional battle. His strategy was pure insurgency. Hit and run, deny resources to the enemy, and force the massive Allied army to chase his tiny force across thousands of miles of incredibly difficult terrain.
And he never surrendered.
He only surrendered 2 weeks after the armistice was signed in Europe, when he was finally shown proof that the war was over. His undefeated campaign became a major point of national pride in Germany after the war.
Finally, in this early period, we need to touch on the vital role of India's support for the Allies, which really adds a complex layer to this whole colonial story.
It's crucial. The British feared a mass revolt in India when the war broke out, but the opposite happened.
Why?
Nationalist leaders, like those in the Indian National Congress, believed that by supporting the British war effort, they could prove India's loyalty and maturity, and that this would speed up the process of getting Indian home rule.
It was a pragmatic political calculation.
It was.
And the scale of that support was immense.
Over 1.3 million Indian soldiers and laborers served across all theaters of the war. About 140,000 of them fought on the Western Front, enduring the horrific conditions of the trenches.
And the cost was high.
Very high. Nearly 48,000 Indian troops were killed.
And what was the legacy of that incredible commitment?
Betrayal. The British government failed to grant any meaningful self-government after the war. This profound sense of disillusionment and betrayal directly fueled the massive post-war independence movement led by Mahatma Gandhi.
So we now move into the period from 1915 and 1917, and the defining image of the entire war, the hellish reality of trench warfare on the Western Front.
This was the disastrous result of a collision between 19th century tactics and 20th century defensive technology.
What's the core of that disconnect?
The generals were still thinking in terms of open warfare and massed infantry charges, but the battlefield was now dominated by three things. Barbed wire, which stopped those charges cold, the machine gun, which can mow down hundreds of men in minutes, and powerful long-range artillery that could obliterate anything in the open.
So trying to cross that open ground between the trenches, no man's land, was basically a suicide mission.
It was.
The resulting battles were just exercises in attrition. Let's look at the two most infamous examples from 1916. Verdun and the Somme.
Verdun was launched by the Germans with the explicit, cynical goal of bleeding France white. They wanted to kill so many French soldiers that France's will to fight would just break.
It became a symbol of French determination.
But at a horrific cost. The total casualties for both sides in that one battle were somewhere between 700,000 and nearly 1 million men. It was just a meat grinder.
And the Battle of the Somme, launched by the British to try and relieve the pressure on Verdun, was just as bad.
The first day of the Somme, July 1st, 1916, is still the single bloodiest day in the entire history of the British Army.
What are the numbers for that one day?
57,500 casualties, including 19,200 killed. Almost 20,000 men killed in a few hours. That's the terrifying efficiency of the machine gun.
And the total for the whole battle?
By the time it ended, there were over 1 million casualties on all sides. 420,000 British, 200,000 French, and 500,000 German.
And beyond the enemy fire, the very conditions in the trenches were deadly.
Oh, yes. Disease was a major killer. The appalling, unhygienic conditions led to things like trench foot, from constant exposure to cold water.
And lice.
Rampant lice infestations, which spread a disease called trench fever. Typhus was also a huge problem. And critically, the constant movement of millions of troops around the globe helped spread the 1918 influenza pandemic, the Spanish flu, which killed far more people than the war itself.
And the sources note a specific epidemic in Serbia right at the start of the war.
Yes, a massive typhus outbreak there killed an estimated 200,000 people in 1914 alone. It just shows how quickly disease could devastate a nation caught up in the conflict.
And during this period, we also see the introduction of chemical weapons, a new low in warfare.
Germany first used poison gas on a large scale at the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915. It was a clear violation of the Hague Convention.
They used chlorine gas.
Yes. And it began this terrifying new form of warfare. Ultimately, chemical weapons weren't decisive in winning the war, but they caused unimaginable suffering. About 1.3 million casualties in total, with around 90,000 of those being fatal.
Now let's turn to the war at sea. It evolved from these big fleet actions to a war of blockades and submarines.
Right. Early on, the Royal Navy hunted down Germany's surface cruisers that were raiding commerce around the globe, but the main strategic naval effort was Britain's blockade of Germany.
Which was very effective, but also legally questionable.
It was. It violated international laws about neutral shipping, but it slowly strangled the German economy, cutting off imports of food and raw materials.
This economic pressure led Germany to risk its whole fleet in one major battle, Jutland.
Jutland in 1916 was the only full-scale clash of battleship fleets in the entire war. Over 250 ships were involved.
And tactically, you could argue Germany won.
You could. They sank more British ships and killed more British sailors. But strategically, Jutland was a massive British victory. Because after the battle, the German high seas fleet, fearing it would be destroyed, never came out to fight again. It stayed in port for the rest of the war, leaving Britain in complete control of the seas and its blockade intact.
So, with its surface fleet bottled up, Germany turned to its only remaining naval weapon, the U-boat.
And they launched a campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare. This was their counter-blockade, an attempt to starve Britain into submission by sinking any ship heading to its ports.
The sinking of the passenger liner Lusitania in 1915 caused huge international outrage.
It did, especially in the United States. As 128 Americans were killed, Germany was forced to temporarily halt the unrestricted campaign.
But they brought it back in 1917.
A catastrophic decision. They gambled that they could strangle Britain before the United States could mobilize and enter the war. It was that decision, more than any other, that brought the U.S. in.
And how did the Allies eventually counter this U-boat threat?
The convoy system. It was a simple but brilliant idea. Instead of merchant ships sailing alone, they traveled in large, protected groups convoys escorted by warships.
Which made them much harder for a lone U-boat to attack.
Much harder. And new technology like hydrophones for detecting submerged subs and depth charges for attacking them finally gave the escorts the tools they needed. Over 5,000 Allied ships were sunk, but the convoy system ultimately saved the war effort.
Now, moving south, the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers in late 1914, opening up huge new fronts.
Yes, this immediately threatened Russia in the Caucasus and Britain's vital Suez Canal link to India.
And the Ottoman leadership had grand ambitions.
The Minister of War, Enver Pasha in particular, he launched a disastrous winter offensive against the Russians at Sarajevo.
What happened there?
He ordered his army to attack through the mountains in the dead of winter. They weren't equipped for the cold. The vast majority of his men, over 70,000 of them, 86% of his force, froze or starved to death before they even saw the enemy.
While that was happening, the Allies launched their own failed campaign at Gallipoli.
A massive failure for the Allies. But elsewhere in the Middle East, they had more success. British forces captured Baghdad in 1917.
And they also supported the air revolt.
Yes, starting in 1916. Aided by figures like T.E. Lawrence, this was critical in destabilizing the Ottoman Empire from within, leading to the capture of key cities like Damascus.
And we have to pause here to discuss a horrific aspect of the Ottoman war effort, something the sources compel us to report on impartially: this systematic ethnic cleansing of Christian minorities.
This is a period that demands incredible gravity and sympathy for the victims. The sources detail how the Ottoman government, using the chaos of the war as cover, conducted a large-scale ethnic cleansing of its Armenian, Greek, and Assyrian Christian populations.
This includes the Armenian genocide.
Yes, which resulted in the deaths of an estimated 1.5 million people.
What was the mechanism used for this, as described in the sources?
The primary tool was a law passed in 1915, the Tessier Law, or deportation law. It authorized the forced removal of Armenians from their homes.
But these weren't just relocations.
No. They were forced death marches into the Syrian desert, designed to kill through exhaustion, starvation, and exposure. Many were also attacked and murdered by militias along the way. The violence also targeted hundreds of thousands of Assyrians and Anatolian Greeks.
Finally, let's look at the Italian front, which opened in 1915.
Right. Italy had been part of the Triple Alliance, but was lured to the Allied side by promises of Austrian territory in the secret Treaty of London.
And this front was geographically unique.
Fought high in the Alps and the Dolomites. The conditions were brutal, fighting in deep snow on treacherous mountain terrain.
And the fighting was defined by costly static battles.
The Italian commander, Cadorna, just kept ordering these unimaginative frontal assaults along the Isonzo River. There were 11 battles of the Isonzo, one after another, achieving almost nothing but costing hundreds of thousands of lives. Italy eventually suffered a crushing defeat at Caporetto in 1917, a huge blow to their morale and their army.
So the year 1917 is this massive turning point in the whole war. It's defined by two huge events: Russia's collapse and America's entry.
By late 1916, Russia was on the brink. They'd suffered millions of casualties. There were severe food shortages. The breaking point came in March 1917 in Petrograd,
when the Tsar ordered troops to fire on striking workers.
And the troops refused. They mutinied. That led to the collapse of the monarchy and the setup of a provisional government.
But that government tried to keep Russia in the war,
which was a fatal mistake. The chaos allowed the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, to seize power in the November Revolution.
And Lenin, who had been helped back into Russia by the Germans.
Who saw him as an agent of chaos? Yes. He immediately demanded an end to the war. In March 1918, Soviet Russia signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk.
A punitive treaty.
Incredibly so. Russia gave up huge amounts of territory and resources: Finland, the Baltic states, parts of Poland, and Ukraine.
But for Germany, it meant they could finally move all their troops from the east to the west.
Nearly 50 divisions. It gave them one last desperate window of opportunity to win the war before the Americans could arrive in large numbers.
So at the same time, the U.S. enters the war in April 1917.
The final trigger was Germany's resumption of that unrestricted submarine warfare.
And the U.S. military at the time was tiny.
Very small. They had to create a massive army from scratch. The Selective Service Act drafted 2.8 million men.
And the American commander, General Pershing, was very insistent on how his troops would be used.
He was. He insisted on two things: First, that the American Expeditionary Forces, the AEF, would fight as a separate independent American army, not be used as replacements for depleted British and French units.
And second,
He was a huge proponent of what he called open warfare. He believed the static trench warfare of the Allies was a strategic dead end, and he wanted his troops to be trained for maneuver and marksmanship.
so Germany knows they are on a clock. They have to win before America is fully mobilized.
Which leads to their final big gamble, the Spring Offensive of 1918, Operation Michael.
And at first, it was incredibly successful.
It was. They achieved an advance of 60 kilometers, the biggest gain by either side since 1914. They used new stormtrooper tactics to bypass strongpoints and create chaos.
But it failed. Why?
Logistics. The troops simply outran their supplies. They were exhausted, and they didn't have the tanks or motorized transport needed to exploit the breakthrough. They just ran out of gas.
And then came the Allied counterattack, the 100 Days Offensive.
Starting in August 1918. And this is where you see the German army's morale finally break. The Allies, now reinforced with fresh American troops and using massed tanks, just punched through the German lines.
And at the same time, Germany's allies started collapsing.
First, Bulgaria. In September, a Serbian and French offensive in the Balkans broke the Macedonian front and Bulgaria surrendered.
And this seemingly distant event sent shockwaves through the German high command.
Absolute shock. The Kaiser reportedly said, disgraceful. 62,000 Serbs decided the war. With Bulgaria gone, the southern flank of the Central Powers was wide open.
And the others followed quickly.
The Ottomans surrendered on October 30th. The Austro-Hungarian army completely disintegrated after a defeat by the Italians at Vittorio Veneto, and they signed an armistice on November 3rd.
Germany was alone, facing revolution at home and mutiny in its navy.
They had no choice. The Kaiser abdicated on November 9th, and the war ended with the signing of the armistice on November 11th, 1918.
So let's talk about the final cost.
Yeah.
We mentioned the 40 million casualty figure. The demographic toll was just staggering.
For a country like France, they lost 1.4 million soldiers. That's 10.5% of their entire active male population. Germany lost 15% of its fighting men.
And the sources compel us to reflect on the wounded, especially those with injuries that were really unique to this new industrial warfare.
Yes. We have to acknowledge the tragedy of the 15,000 French soldiers who suffered such horrific facial injuries from shrapnel and artillery that they were known as the gueules cassées, the broken faces.
And they faced terrible stigma after the war.
Terrible social marginalization. Reconstructive surgery was in its infancy. Many were hidden away. It's a really stark reminder of the human cost beyond just the death toll.
And we should also remember the civilian deaths from the blockade.
In Germany alone, the sources note almost 500,000 excess civilian deaths from food shortages and malnutrition, made much, much worse by that British naval blockade.
The political map of the world was completely redrawn. 4 massive empires just disappeared.
The Russian, the German, the Austro-Hungarian, and the Ottoman empires were all gone. The ruling dynasties, the Romanovs, the Hohenzollerns, the Habsburgs, the Ottomans, all fell.
And in their place, a host of new nations.
Poland, Finland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and others, all created out of the ashes of those old empires.
The post-war settlement was hammered out at the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, and it's often seen as planting the seeds for the next war.
The key source of German resentment was Article 231, the so-called War Guilt Clause. It forced Germany to accept full responsibility for causing all the loss and damage of the war.
And this created a narrative of humiliation.
A powerful one. The feeling in Germany was that this was a Versailles diktat, a dictated peace, not a negotiated one. It left the country feeling politically humiliated and economically ruined.
But the sources also provide an important clarification on the reparations. The headline figure was 132 billion gold marks, which sounds impossible.
And that's a critical point for you to understand. While that was the official number, Allied experts knew Germany could never pay it. The actual amount they were expected to pay was set at 50 billion gold marks.
So the bigger number was more for political consumption back home in Britain and France.
Largely, yes. But it was the 132 billion figure that fueled the political resentment and the narrative of an impossible burden, even if the reality of the payments was different. In fact, Germany made its final payment on bonds related to this war debt in 2010.
The war also forged new national identities, especially for places like Australia and New Zealand.
For them, the disastrous Gallipoli campaign became their baptism of fire. That shared sacrifice, so far from home, really fostered a sense of independent national identity that endures to this day with the commemoration of Anzac Day.
And briefly, the technological and environmental legacy.
The war massively accelerated technology,
Yeah.
communications, artillery coordination, and we saw the first use of aircraft carriers in combat. But the environmental legacy is also permanent.
The Iron Harvest.
The Iron Harvest. And the Zone Rouge, the Red Zone in France, huge areas of land that are still, to this day, so contaminated with unexploded shells and chemicals that they are uninhabitable, a permanent scar on the landscape.
So we've traced the sheer magnitude of this conflict from that tangled web of causes through the catastrophe of the trenches to the armistice that redrew the map of the world. The war was tragically called the War to End War. The Paris Peace Conference's goal was to ensure this could never happen again. So with that in mind, what specific factor born directly out of the trauma of 1914-1918 do the sources suggest was the most direct cause of World War II just 2 decades later?
The sources really point to a combination of things centered on German resentment and the failure of the new international system. Specifically, it's that deep political humiliation from the war guilt clause and the Versailles diktat narrative.
It led to a denial of responsibility.
A widespread denial of war guilt among the German people. And it was that denial, combined with an aggressive political push to revise the treaty and the absolute inability of the new League of Nations to enforce international order. That combination became the overwhelming force driving Europe towards another war in the 1930s.
That denial of guilt, rooted in the humiliation of 1919. One of the darkest and most lasting legacies of the entire conflict. Thanks for listening.